I hadn't planned on crossing the border that day. The map on my phone showed nothing but a winding dirt trail, a mess of topography and foreign script, the kind of no-man's land that usually warns travelers to turn around. But my bike was running low on gas, and the mountain air was turning colder than expected. I spotted what looked like a cluster of rooftops in the distance, behind a bend in the hills, and told myself it was just a shortcut, just another nameless pit stop on the way to somewhere real. By the time the first building came into view, the clouds were too thick for the sun to matter anymore. The town had no welcome sign, no border post, no checkpoint, just a narrow paved road that curved inward like a funnel and a rusted gate that stood permanently ajar. It didn't feel abandoned, not exactly, more like a place waiting to be noticed again. The buildings were a strange hybrid of old-world architecture and brutalist decay, like Cold War leftovers preserved under glass. Signs hung from doorways in a language I couldn't identify. Not Cyrillic, not Latin, not Arabic, just wrong. Familiar enough to feel readable, but the letters shifted when I stared too long, like they didn't want to be understood. I parked my bike near what looked like a small cafe, though the windows were blackened from the inside, and the door had no handle. There were people on the street, that much I was sure of, but they moved strangely, without rhythm, without intent. One man crossed the street 4 times in a row without ever changing expression. A woman stood outside a bakery holding a loaf of bread that never seemed to lose its steam. No one spoke. No one acknowledged me. It was as if I were watching an open-world video game in idle mode, and the NPCs had no scripts to follow. I tried to ask for directions, but every time I opened my mouth, the words came out slower than I intended, like I was speaking underwater. One of the townspeople, a child maybe 9 or 10 years old, tilted his head and smiled at me without blinking. He raised one finger to his lips in a shushing gesture and held it there until I walked away. That was the first time I noticed the complete absence of sound. No birds, no engines, not even the wind through the trees. Just silence, stretched tight like a wire. I decided to check into what looked like a boarding house near the center of town. The door was unlocked. The woman behind the desk didn't ask for ID or payment or even a name. She handed me a key with a red ribbon tied to it and pointed to the staircase. The hallway upstairs was longer than the building should have allowed. I passed 6 rooms before reaching mine, but when I turned to count them again, there were only 4. My door had a number carved into it, not painted, but gouged deep into the wood, as if by a claw. I wish I could tell you what number it was, but I swear it changed every time I blinked. Inside, the room was unremarkable. A bed, a mirror, a closet with no handle. The window looked out onto an alley I hadn't walked through, but I could see my motorcycle parked at the exact same angle I'd left it, even though the road it was on didn't connect to this side of the building. I sat on the bed, pulled off my boots, and tried to shake the fatigue that was already sinking into my bones like smoke. It was only 4 p.m., but the sky outside had turned an oppressive shade of grey that felt more like metal than cloud. I tried to use my phone, but there was no signal, no Wi-Fi, no GPS. Even the clock had frozen at 3:17 p.m. and wouldn't budge. I shrugged it off as a glitch, but when I tried to set the time manually, the settings menu vanished. My battery dropped from 80% to 2% in 1 minute flat. I plugged it in, but the charging icon just blinked in and out like a dying firefly. I gave up, lay back on the bed, and closed my eyes for just a moment. When I woke up, it was night. But the silence hadn't changed. The town outside the window was still and grey, as if the stars themselves refused to shine on this place. I checked the time again. 3:17 p.m. Still. My phone was dead. The mirror on the far wall had fogged over from the inside, even though the room was cold. And on the edge of the window pane, scratched so lightly I nearly missed it, was a word in that same shifting language I'd seen on the signs outside. But this time, I understood it. It said, "Stay." I woke up to the same silence. But something about it had changed. It was heavier now, like the quiet had grown teeth in the night. The room was exactly as I had left it, but it felt inverted somehow, as if the corners had subtly warped inward. The light through the window was dim and unfocused, like the sky had forgotten how to shine properly. I stood slowly, expecting some creak from the floorboards beneath my feet, but they didn't make a sound. Even my own breath seemed to die inches from my mouth. I decided I had seen enough. Whatever charm this place pretended to have when I arrived was gone, peeled back like a rotten mask. I was leaving. Now. I packed quickly, barely bothering to tie my boots. The hallway outside my room was shorter than I remembered. Where there had once been 6 doors, then 4, now there were only 2. I passed them without looking too closely. The woman at the front desk was still there, still unmoving, her eyes fixed on nothing. Her mouth was slightly open now, like she was halfway through a breath she'd never finish. I didn't speak. I didn't even look at her for more than a second. I just stepped out into the street and hoped to God the road hadn't changed. The town looked different in daylight, if you could call it that. The buildings seemed taller, but only when I wasn't looking directly at them. The roads were narrower, but I couldn't tell if they'd shrunk or if the town was just closing in around me. I made a straight line for my bike, still parked exactly where I left it, untouched. But when I turned the key, the engine didn't even click. I tried again. Nothing. I pulled my phone. Still dead. My hands were shaking now, not from cold, but from something deeper. Something more primitive. I wasn't alone here. I had never been alone here. I decided to walk. The road out of town should have curved back into the forest, back toward the dirt path that had led me here. But after 20 minutes of walking, all I found was another intersection. Same street. Same signs. Same woman with the steaming loaf of bread. The steam still rose from it, identical to how it had yesterday. Or was it still yesterday? I turned around and walked back the other way. Another 20 minutes, another intersection. Same scene. This time, the man who crossed the street did it 5 times instead of 4. I stopped walking. I turned in a slow circle. The town was folding in on itself. The air felt thinner with each step. My ears rang with pressure that didn't belong at this altitude. I ducked into a corner store that hadn't been there before. It was lit by a single buzzing light bulb that hung too low, casting hard shadows that swam across the shelves. The products on display were wrapped in packaging I couldn't read. Same shifting script as before, but the colors were off, too vibrant, as if painted in by someone who had only ever seen food described in words, never in real life. A glass refrigerator hummed in the back, empty except for a single bottle of water that flickered slightly, as if its pixels hadn't fully rendered. I left the store and made a new plan: follow the power lines. If the town had electricity, it had to be connected to something real, somewhere. I found a wire and traced it with my eyes up to a pole, then another, then another. I started walking. It took 15 minutes before I realized the wires weren't leading out of town. They looped, not in a circle, in a spiral. Every pole was a copy of the last, each one weathered in exactly the same way, with the same crack on the 4th crossbar. The illusion of difference was gone now. The town wasn't even pretending anymore. I started to panic. I ran to the edge of the plaza, there was a plaza now, and screamed, just screamed, as loud as I could until my throat tore and the blood rushed to my head and the pressure burst behind my eyes, and still nothing. No echo, no response, no wind. just the eyes of the townspeople, all of them now staring at me. Every single one, their faces still calm, still waiting. One by one, they began to smile. I didn't wait to see what came next. I turned and ran back to the boarding house, the only place that still seemed remotely familiar. But when I reached the door, it wasn't there. The building was gone, replaced by something else entirely. A brick structure with no windows, no entrance. I circled it twice before giving up. I backed away slowly until my spine hit something solid. I turned. It was the child. The same one from before. Finger still raised to his lips. But this time his eyes were black, solid, reflective like polished obsidian. He shook his head slowly and stepped aside, revealing the mirror from my room, standing in the street, upright and flawless, as if it had grown from the concrete itself. My reflection stared back at me, but behind it, the town was on fire. Only, when I turned around, the flames were gone. The mirror did not reflect what was in front of me. That was the first thing I noticed. I stood there, in the center of a town that had twisted itself inside out and stared into a version of myself that was breathing just slightly out of sync. The streets behind my reflection burned, orange light flickering, black smoke curling upward like inverted tree roots. But the real town remained deathly still, unnervingly pristine. I reached out and touched the mirror's surface, expecting cold glass. Instead, it was warm, and it pulsed. Once, like a heartbeat, I pulled my hand back instinctively. That was when I heard it. Not a sound exactly, but an arrangement of thoughts that were not my own. They weren't words, but they carried shape, weight. I didn't hear them. I understood them. And they said, "This is not for escape. This is for learning." Then came a second thought, slower, more deliberate. "You brought us curiosity. We gave you reflection. Now, show us ending." I stumbled backward, feeling the temperature of the world shift again. Shadows bent where they shouldn't, turning corners that didn't exist a moment ago. The buildings leaned inward. The sky was no longer a sky. It was a sheet, grey, breathable, watching. I ran. There was nowhere to run. I found the bakery again. The same woman still held the same loaf of bread, but this time her mouth moved, not to speak, just open and close like practicing. Her eyes never blinked. I screamed again. Nothing answered, not even the silent crowd. But this time, I didn't stop. I shouted every curse I could remember. I kicked over benches. I smashed windows. I threw rocks at the buildings, at the people, at the sky. And then I said something I hadn't thought about before. "I don't belong here. I'm not like you." And everything froze. All at once the air stiffened, the colors in the sky inverted. The people vanished, not walked away, not ran, just blinked out like they were never there to begin with. The buildings remained, the roads remained, but I was alone, truly, utterly alone. And then the sky spoke again, not in language, but in sensation. "Then why did you come?" I fell to my knees. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know. Was it the road that called to me? Was it the silence of a life I didn't understand? The town hadn't pulled me in. I had driven toward it. I had chosen this place. I screamed at the sky again because I thought I needed to be lost. The ground cracked beneath me, but there was no quake. The world shifted like a paper being folded. Buildings twisted into staircases. Roads split upward into shapes that shouldn't exist. The sky stretched open to reveal nothing, not stars, not clouds, just space, empty and terrifying and ancient. And within it, myself. Not a reflection, a copy. Another me walking calmly toward the mirror. It placed its hand on the surface. I placed mine opposite it. And when our fingers touched, I felt it. The town. It had never been a place. It was a mind, or maybe something that wanted to be, something incomplete. It had built this imitation world as a way to understand us, to test empathy, to test choice. It didn't trap people. It studied them, consumed only what it needed. And I had passed a threshold. The mirror shattered. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in a ditch on the side of a dirt road. My motorcycle was on its side, engine dead. No buildings, no towns, just wilderness and the quiet hum of real wind. I sat up. My mouth was dry. My fingers were bleeding. My backpack was missing. My phone fried. But I was out. Or so I thought. In the distance, down the road, I saw something familiar. A small shape, a child, standing still, one finger raised to his lips. I never intended to find that village. Like most travelers chasing silence, I was only looking for space, somewhere untouched by tourists, unfiltered by Instagram, and unburdened by language. My trip through the Balkans had been improvised from the start, but that day, something else guided me. The bus dropped me off miles from where I meant to be on a winding road that clung to the edge of a mountain like a cracked ribbon. The wind carried no sound but its own breath, and the sun dipped just low enough to turn the sky a bruised grey. I wasn't lost, not exactly, but the world around me felt like it had forgotten what direction meant. When I first saw the village, it didn't feel real. The houses were weathered, almost sunken, their roofs caved slightly in the middle like they were bowing to something unseen. There were no cars, no satellite dishes, no wires, just chimney smoke drifting up in lazy spirals and dissolving into the evening sky. It didn't appear on any map, not even the offline ones I'd downloaded. Still, something about it pulled at me like a dream I hadn't finished. My legs were tired, my back sore, and my phone had been dead for hours. So when I stepped over the small wooden bridge that crossed into the village, I told myself I was just looking for shelter. But deep down, I knew I'd already crossed into something else entirely. They welcomed me without speaking. A woman, tall, barefoot, wearing a dress the color of faded bone, emerged from behind a crooked door and gestured for me to follow. Her face was calm, unreadable, her eyes pale but not unfriendly. The house she led me to smelled of ash and old bread. Inside, others sat around a table, 5 or 6, maybe more. None of them spoke, but they nodded in unison when I entered, as if they had been waiting for me specifically. They served a bowl of thick stew and a slice of hard bread, along with a cup carved from dark wood, filled with something hot and bitter. I ate because I was starving and drank because I was thirsty, but every bite felt ceremonial, like I was participating in a ritual I didn't understand. After the meal, the barefoot woman led me to a narrow room with a thin mattress and walls made of uneven stone. She touched my arm gently, her fingers cold and dry, and then she left without a word. I lay down and listened. The silence wasn't quiet. It was dense, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then came the sound, a soft, distant humming, like bees trapped behind a wall, or the vibration of a cello string just after it's been plucked. It didn't frighten me, it lulled me. I fell asleep without meaning to. When I awoke, it was morning, or at least I thought it was. The sky outside was the same dull grey I remembered from the evening before, but flatter, like it had been painted on. My watch read 6:42 a.m. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for the second hand to twitch. It didn't. I shook it. Nothing. I reached for my phone, still dead. I got up and stepped outside. The village was silent. No voices, no movement, no smoke. Every door was closed, every window dark. It felt abandoned, but in a way that suggested it had always been abandoned. Like the people I'd seen were only temporary echoes, flickering into form for a single night. I wandered the paths between the houses calling out, though I didn't expect anyone to answer. I found myself back at the house I'd slept in, though I was sure I had taken a different route. The barefoot woman was there again, standing just beyond the tree line. Her dress moved in the wind, though I felt no breeze. She raised her hand, not waving, just lifting it, as if to remind me she was still watching. Then she turned and walked into the woods, and I followed. I didn't ask myself why. Something in me had already accepted that questions didn't matter here. The forest swallowed me quickly. The trees grew too close together, and the deeper I went, the less sense the world made. The path curled in on itself, and shadows moved without light. My body felt heavy, like gravity had increased just for me. And all the while, the hum returned, faint, continuous, vibrating through my bones instead of my ears. I began to feel like I was being watched from every direction, but never by anything visible, just a presence, a witness. Eventually, I stumbled into a small clearing where the earth was soft and warm, almost pulsing. I sat down without meaning to. My eyelids fell shut. The hum rose in pitch, then dropped suddenly like a breath being held. Everything went black. I don't remember standing up. I only remember that the forest was gone. I stood at the center of the village once more, as if I had never left. The trees were a distant outline now, a dark green smudge on the edge of a fog-drenched horizon. The same houses surrounded me, but something was wrong. They looked subtly different, walls slightly taller, roofs angled in ways I didn't recall, doors with handles I swear weren't there before. The woman with the bone-colored dress was nowhere in sight. No one was. The entire place pulsed with silence, not the natural kind, but a forced, deadening quiet, as if the world had been paused and only I had slipped through the cracks. I decided to leave. The compulsion was immediate and physical, as if my muscles no longer belonged to me. My feet carried me to the edge of the village, where a thin dirt path wound through dry brush and faded into mist. I followed it with determined steps, my mind clawing toward normalcy. There had to be a road, a bus, another person, anything. The path led into a sparse meadow, then sloped downward into what should have been the outskirts of civilization. But it wasn't. It curved right, sharply, unnaturally, then curled back up, bringing me to a fork I recognized. I had passed this exact tree before, a gnarled, half-burned husk, leaning left like it mourned something. I turned around. The path behind me was gone. Not overgrown, not erased, just gone. The space it should have occupied was now a hill that shouldn't be there, crowned by a lone scarecrow I hadn't seen earlier. Its arms were long, too long, and its head slouched slightly forward, as if it were listening. My breath caught in my throat. I turned and kept walking, but no matter how far I went, the landscape offered only variations of the same lie. Meadows that looped into themselves, fences that bent in impossible geometries, sky that remained the same dead shade of overcast. I shouted for help. My voice felt like it was swallowed mid-air, absorbed by something larger than the sky itself. By the time I made it back, though I still don't understand how, I had started forgetting things. My phone, my wallet, my bag, all missing. I remembered having them, vividly. I remembered placing my phone in my jacket pocket when I left the house. But now I couldn't remember the jacket, or if I had ever worn one. I sat on a stone by the bridge and tried to recite my name aloud. Nothing came. Not even a syllable. My mouth opened, but my tongue fell still. I tried to force it, tried to push past the static wall rising in my mind, but the harder I thought, the faster my thoughts unraveled. I looked down at my hands and couldn't decide if they were mine. A child watched me from behind a crumbling wall. Her eyes were impossibly large, her face round but featureless, like a wax doll left too close to a fire. When she blinked, the sound was audible, like a camera shutter. She didn't move. I blinked once, twice, and she was gone. But the wall behind her was now further away than before, or I was closer. My perception no longer obeyed geometry. Angles didn't make sense. I passed through an alley that was narrower than my shoulders and yet didn't brush the sides. A door led to a stairwell that spiraled downward, but brought me out on a roof. Everything about the village had been rearranged, not to trap me, but to dismantle me. Inside one of the houses I found a mirror. It stood alone in a dark room, cracked vertically down the center. My reflection was blurry, as if the glass didn't believe in my shape anymore. I waved. The reflection didn't. I moved closer. My face was wrong, distorted in subtle ways. My eyes were slightly farther apart, my smile unfamiliar, like a stranger trying to imitate me. I touched the mirror. The glass rippled. The sound that escaped it was like breathing. Then came whispers. Several voices layered together, speaking in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. They said I had entered the place between, the place with no maps, no names, no history. The village wasn't lost. It was where things go when they are forgotten. And I was forgetting. Each step I took now felt like surrender. My thoughts drifted like leaves on water, visible, momentarily solid, then gone. I stopped looking for a way out. I no longer knew what out meant. Doors led to fields, fields led to cellars, and cellars echoed with familiar laughter I couldn't place. I began seeing people again, but not as I remembered. They shimmered like heat above asphalt, and their mouths moved silently, always mouthing the same phrase. You're almost here. Here, not home, not free. Here. I no longer remembered why I had come here. The thought was once bright, shining like a postcard image of mountains and foreign adventure, but it had since faded into a grey mist, the same mist that now filled my lungs. I awoke on a bench I didn't remember sleeping on in a square I hadn't seen before, though the same crooked houses loomed around it like silent witnesses. Above, the sky hung flat and low, not cloudy, just tired. I tried to think, but the act of remembering hurt now. Each thought I tried to retrieve crumbled like ash in my hands. I knew I was someone, a traveler, a woman, maybe, but every label felt borrowed. A figure approached me, slowly, silently, draped in a shawl the color of smoke. Their face was obscured, but I didn't need to see it. I knew they had been watching me for some time. Maybe since the first night. Maybe longer. They didn't speak, but offered me an object wrapped in faded linen. I unwrapped it with trembling fingers. A compass. Except it had no needle, just a single word etched where the needle should be. Stay. That's when I understood. This village wasn't a place on any map, because it existed after maps ended. It was where the lost was slowly unmade, where names bled out of minds and identities decayed like fallen leaves. It didn't capture people, it waited for them, it fed on weariness, on the small cracks in our sense of self. And once it had you, it didn't need chains, it let you unravel. I hadn't stumbled into the wrong village, I had wandered into the last one I'd ever see. Because I had wanted to disappear, hadn't I? not intentionally, but somewhere deep inside, beneath the curated travel photos and cheerful updates, I was hollow. I was already loosening. The villagers had once been like me. I could see it now in their stillness, in the way their eyes didn't quite focus. Some wandered barefoot in endless loops. Some stood facing blank walls for hours. Some smiled without meaning it. They weren't trapped. They were finished. The process was gentle, almost kind. No violence, no screams, just a soft, steady erosion of being. You stayed long enough, and you were no longer sure who you had been. And then, just like that, you weren't. I rose slowly and walked back toward the square. The bench was still there. So was the figure. They gestured toward a house I hadn't entered before. It was small, wooden, and had a red door that looked almost freshly painted. I stepped inside. The air was thick with a scent I couldn't identify, part incense, part memory. Inside was a bed, a chair, and a mirror. I sat down and looked into the glass. My reflection smiled. I didn't. I hadn't eaten in 2 days, not properly. Just a few stale crackers I'd rationed out of my backpack and a bottle of juice that tasted like fermented metal, purchased from a machine that wheezed in a Kathmandu alleyway like it was dying. Nepal hadn't been part of my original itinerary, but backpacking is like that. One missed bus, one depleted ATM card, and suddenly the cheapest, strangest sounding destination becomes the next logical move. I told myself I was chasing freedom, that I was untethered and brave. But by then, freedom tasted more like moldy carbohydrates and low-grade nausea than anything poetic. As I wandered near the Tamil bus stop, my eyes caught sight of a weathered flyer stapled to a cracked wooden post. The faded paper fluttered slightly in the breeze, bearing the promise of free meals, free lodging, real connection, come find your place at the Valley of Kindness. Beneath it, handwritten in hurried red ink, were the words, "Only for true seekers." The whole thing looked like a cheap gimmick, but with hunger gnawing at my ribs and options running dry, I snapped a quick photo before shoving my phone back into my jacket pocket, uncertain if I was making a terrible mistake or the best decision of my trip. By noon the next day, I found myself squeezed into a rattling local bus, bouncing through winding dirt roads that faded into the wild fringes of the valley. The sky was a dull grey, and the trees swayed silently as if whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. The cell signal dropped to nothing, and the bus rolled on through terrain so unfamiliar it felt like crossing into another world. When I finally disembarked, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of damp earth and wildflowers. Ahead of me stretched a secluded valley, cradled by softly rolling hills and carpeted with terraced greens. The sight was unexpectedly beautiful. Small, hand-built cottages, weathered but sturdy, dotted the landscape, and a large wooden communal hall stood at the heart of it all, its surface carved with symbols that seemed to shimmer oddly in the muted sunlight. Some vaguely Nepali, others utterly alien. About 30 people moved through the valley with a calm, almost ritualistic grace. They were barefoot and dressed in earth-toned robes that looked handmade, yet impeccably clean. Among them were Westerners, locals, and others I couldn't place, each face serene, well-fed, and strangely at peace. A tall man with a wide, unsettling smile introduced himself as Tova. His voice was calm and measured, the kind you hear in documentaries about cult leaders, but instead of preaching, he simply handed me a bowl filled with steaming lentils, rice, and fresh bread. I didn't hesitate. I ate quickly, ravenous. No one laughed, no one judged, they just watched, their eyes calm and unreadable. Over the next 2 days, I settled into their rhythm. Food came regularly and was nourishing. My small private room inside a clay cottage was simple but clean, and the community treated me with a warmth I hadn't expected. They asked me questions about my travels and what I was searching for, questions I answered with the usual cliches about peace and simplicity, though a part of me was desperate just for a break from the grind of daily survival. Tova smiled knowingly when I mentioned capitalism, telling me I'd come to the right place. The valley had no phone signal or internet, a fact I didn't fully register until the 3rd day when I instinctively reached for my phone only to realize it was useless here. When I asked about Wi-Fi, Tova's smile deepened into a mysterious curve, and he asked softly, "Do you really need it anymore?" I wanted to say yes, but an unfamiliar hesitation rooted me in silence. Days began with silent meditation at dawn, followed by communal breakfasts and light labor, gardening, cooking, fixing roofs. I was assigned to wash vegetables with a woman named Alina, who told me the days blurred here, time losing meaning, but she seemed content, almost entranced. "They don't force anything," she said, slicing ginger with a knife that looked carved by hand. "You just start to feel what's right." When I asked if she ever thought of leaving, she laughed softly, admitting that sometimes she tried, but her feet refused to listen. At the time, I thought it was a joke, a light-hearted comment masking deeper truths. By the end of my first week, I noticed I no longer felt hunger the same way, waking before sunrise without alarm, craving nothing but the valley's quiet presence. The silence wasn't empty, it was full of a pulse, a breath that seemed to sync with my own. Then I saw the gate. It was out of place, tall, iron and locked, hidden behind a curtain of bamboo and vines at the far edge of the valley. Unlike the soft curves of the cottages and communal hall, the gate was harsh and forbidding, more prison than sanctuary. When I asked Tova about it, his smile faltered, and he said slowly, "That gate is not for you." Pressing further, I learned it was meant for those who tried to take what they weren't ready for. That night, I dreamed of the gate creaking open and a sound emerging from it, not voices or screams, but a low frequency that seemed to pull at my very bones. I woke screaming, drenched in sweat, but no one came. The next morning, Alina wouldn't meet my eyes and warned me to stop thinking about the gate. Those who obsessed over it, she said quietly, were the ones who disappeared. I laughed then, but the laughter felt hollow. The days blurred into one another like watercolors bleeding together, colors shifting but never quite settling. Life in the Valley of Kindness followed a strange, gentle rhythm, but beneath its calm surface, something was quietly twisting in my mind. Each morning, I woke before the sun, the soft glow of dawn filtering through my window and painting the clay walls with pale gold. The air smelled faintly of herbs and damp earth, and the distant murmur of birdsong blended with the low hum of unseen insects. I moved through my morning rituals mechanically, silent meditation beneath ancient trees, a breakfast of freshly cooked grains and steaming tea, then a shift in the communal gardens or kitchen. My hands learned the texture of rough vegetables and the cool weight of watering cans, but my mind was elsewhere, tangled in a creeping unease. I watched the others with growing suspicion and fascination. They were all so calm, so perfect in their roles, their faces tranquil masks that never cracked. Elena remained the closest companion, her Finnish accent soft and steady as she explained that this place was not about force, but about surrender. "You just start to want what's here," she said once, her eyes distant. "It's like the valley breathes into you and pulls you down into itself." I laughed then, a brittle sound, but there was truth in her words that unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Despite their warm welcomes, the eyes that followed me didn't always feel kind. Sometimes, when I caught their gaze, It was as if they were measuring me, weighing me for something I didn't understand. The smile Tova wore was the worst, too wide, too knowing, and whenever I asked questions about the valley's origins or the people who lived there before, his answers grew vague and cold. "We are seekers," he said once, voice smooth as silk but with an edge that made me shiver. "But some journeys must end here." One afternoon, as the sun lowered behind the hills and painted the sky with bruised purples and deep oranges, I ventured closer to the iron gate that haunted my dreams. The bamboo and vines shrouding it seemed to ripple unnaturally in the breeze, and a chill crawled up my spine as I reached out to touch the cold metal bars. The gate was locked tight, old rust eating away at its surface, but what unsettled me most wasn't the gate itself. It was the silence that pressed behind it, a silence so complete it felt like the valley was holding its breath. That evening, during the communal meal, I tried to bring up the gate again, hoping for answers. Tova's smile tightened imperceptibly and he said, "The gate is a boundary. Some things are meant to stay out or in. Those who respect the valley find peace. Those who do not stay." The group nodded in solemn agreement, their eyes reflecting flickers of candlelight and something darker, warning or threat. I felt the weight of their collective gaze settle on me like a shadow. Night was the hardest time. The valley's silence deepened, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves and the distant call of night birds. I lay awake, listening to the slow thrum of my heartbeat and the faint creak of wood settling. Shadows lengthened across my walls, twisting into shapes that felt both ancient and malevolent. Dreams came thick and heavy, visions of endless corridors, faces blurred and shifting, and always the gate creaking open to release that terrible vibrating sound that seemed to reach inside me and claw at my bones. When I woke, sweat soaked my skin and my chest heaved with panic that refused to dissipate. Elena noticed my growing distress. One morning, while washing carrots together, she spoke quietly, almost as if confessing a secret. "The valley doesn't just feed your body," she said, her voice low. "It feeds on something else. We all feel it. At first, it's subtle, like a tug on your soul. Then it becomes a hunger that nothing else can satisfy." Her eyes flickered nervously, and for the first time I saw fear there, fear hidden beneath layers of calm. I pressed her for more, but she shook her head. "Don't ask too much. Some questions don't want answers." I realized then that I wasn't the first outsider to come here searching for refuge, and I might not be the last to lose myself. The valley was alive in ways I couldn't comprehend, a breathing entity that embraced and ensnared. Each day, I felt the boundaries between myself and the valley blur, as if I were being slowly absorbed into its vast, unknowable presence. One night, I heard whispers just beyond my door. Soft, unintelligible murmurs that stirred the hairs on my neck. I stepped outside and saw shadows moving between the cottages, figures gliding silently as if weightless. I called out, but the valley swallowed my voice whole. When I returned to my room, my belongings were rearranged, small personal items missing, replaced by strange tokens carved from wood and stone. I began to wonder if the valley was trying to communicate or warn me. My dreams became darker, visions of the gates swinging open wider, releasing waves of sound and shadow that promised freedom and oblivion all at once. I started to question my own sanity, the line between waking and dreaming dissolving like mist in the morning sun. I knew then that leaving wouldn't be as simple as walking out the gate, because the valley had already begun to claim me. The grip the valley held on me tightened with every passing day, a slow suffocation disguised as comfort. My reflection in the communal hall's cracked mirror became a stranger's face, eyes sunken, skin pale, but with a strange calm that felt less like peace and more like surrender. I no longer noticed the hunger or thirst, only a growing emptiness deep inside, like a hollow carved from silence and shadow. The other residents moved around me like ghosts, serene and detached, but I sensed a subtle shift, an undercurrent of urgency beneath their tranquility. One evening, Tova gathered us all in the wooden hall. His voice, usually so soothing, carried an edge I hadn't heard before. "Tonight, some will choose to remain in the valley's embrace," he began, "and others will be tested." He spoke of a rite, a passage through the gate that marked the boundary between those who belonged and those who did not. I felt a cold shiver trace my spine. The gate, that forbidding iron barrier, was no longer a distant mystery. It was the valley's final claim. After the meeting, I found Alina in the garden, her face pale and eyes flickering with fear and resignation. She whispered, "It's not a choice, really. Once the valley touches you, it pulls you in deeper. The gate opens only for those ready to lose themselves completely." Her words struck me like a blow. Was I ready, or had I already lost myself? That night, sleep escaped me. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows writhed and stretched until they filled the room. I heard the gate creak open again in my dreams, the same dreadful hum vibrating through my bones. Compelled by a force I couldn't resist, I rose and slipped out into the valley's cool darkness. The moon cast pale light over the hills, illuminating the gate as if it were a beacon calling me home. As I approached, the air thickened, charged with an ancient energy that made my skin tingle and my heart race. I reached out, the cold metal biting into my palm, and the gate swung open silently, revealing a swirling void of shadows and light, an abyss that seemed to pulse with life. The valley whispered promises of freedom, of belonging, of an end to the gnawing emptiness I'd carried for so long. Stepping through felt like falling through layers of reality, through memories and fears, through every fragmented piece of myself I'd tried to leave behind. Faces flickered at the edges of the void, friends I'd lost, regrets I'd buried, hopes I'd abandoned. The valley was not just a place, it was a living labyrinth of souls, each trapped and intertwined in its endless embrace. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. Panic surged as I realized the gate was closing behind me, the metal pressing against my back like a tomb, sealing shut. The last thing I saw was Tova's serene smile, his eyes gleaming with something both cruel and compassionate. "Welcome home," he whispered, and the darkness consumed me. When I awoke, I was back in the valley, but something was irrevocably changed. My body moved with fluid grace, my mind quiet, yet profoundly alert. I was no longer the hungry, lost traveler who had arrived weeks ago. I was part of the valley now, a guardian, a seeker, a prisoner. Alina approached me, her smile faint and knowing. "You belong," she said simply. "And soon you'll help bring others here, like we were brought." The valley feeds on the lost and the searching. It gives, but it takes more. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but the valley's breath was in my lungs, its pulse in my veins. I was caught in a beautiful, terrible cycle, a never-ending journey without exit. And somewhere, beyond the locked gate, the world went on, unaware of the souls quietly vanishing into the valley of kindness. I didn't run out of fear. Not at first. At first, I left because the silence had started to spread inside my head like desert dust, thick, choking, and endless. The cult's compound was buried deep in the arid wasteland, miles from any semblance of civilization, where the sun beat down relentlessly and the horizon melted into a shimmer of heat waves. Their promises of enlightenment and freedom were nothing but a mirage, an elaborate cage dressed up in ancient rites and whispered prayers. Each day stretched longer than the last, time folding in on itself until I couldn't tell if it had been hours or days since I last felt real air in my lungs. The desert didn't just hold us captive, it rewrote the way we moved through the world. When I finally broke free, I thought the nightmare was over. I thought I could outrun the way time had twisted around me. The escape was chaos, a blur of sand and shadows under a bleeding orange sky. I didn't plan it, there was no grand moment of courage, only a raw, animal desperation to breathe, to be anywhere but there. The guards were distracted by the evening ritual, their chants echoing hollowly across the compound's stone walls. I slipped through a gap in the fence, stumbling blindly into the cold bite of night, the vast desert swallowing me whole. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing beneath a sky spattered with stars that felt impossibly distant, like watching someone else's life play out in a dream. But freedom came with a price. The desert was a cruel guide, its beauty masking a deadly indifference. Days passed without food or water, the sun turning my skin to parchment and my mind to something frayed at the edges. When I finally reached the nearest town, a speck of civilization lost on the map, I was a shadow of myself, hollow-eyed, haunted, and unmoored from the flow of time that everyone else seemed to follow. That's when the real terror began, not from the cult, not from the desert's scorching grip, but from the shifting currents inside my own mind. Time no longer marched forward in a steady rhythm. It bent and swirled around me like a sandstorm, impossible to grasp or predict. Minutes stretched into hours, and hours collapsed into seconds, memories bleeding into one another like watercolors run dry. Faces from the cult appeared unbidden in my dreams and waking moments alike, their smiles carved from something older and darker than human kindness. People around me moved with a speed and ease I couldn't match, their conversations blurring into a stream of incomprehensible noise. The world had become unrecognizable, a place where yesterday felt like a lifetime ago, and tomorrow was a fading echo I could no longer chase. I was trapped in a different desert now, one made of fractured time and fractured sanity, and I didn't know if I was still running or already lost. The townsfolk stared at me like I was some kind of ghost, a wandering relic from a story they didn't want to finish telling. Their eyes held suspicion, cold and unblinking, as if they knew what I'd fled from but were too afraid to say it aloud. I tried to explain, to piece together the fractured memories that clung to me like desert sand, but the words came out tangled and hollow. The desert cult's grip extended beyond the barren wasteland. It reached into this place, into their whispers and sideways glances. Nights were the worst. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the temperature dropped sharply, the silence was filled with distant, echoing footsteps that weren't mine, and the sharp scent of burnt sage curling in the dry air. It was as if the desert itself was hunting me, dragging time along with it like a leash. Sleep became a battleground between what was real and what was born of my unraveling mind. Dreams didn't follow normal rules. They bled into waking hours with the precision of a predator stalking its prey. I would wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding from visions of the cult's leader standing at the edge of the desert, his smile cruel and knowing. The desert wasn't done with me, and neither was he. My reflection fractured in cracked mirrors and water puddles, showing different versions of myself, sometimes terrified, sometimes calm, sometimes something else altogether, a stranger trapped behind my eyes. I felt time slipping away, not just outside but inside me, as if the hours and days I'd lost in the desert were still being counted against my soul. No one else seemed affected. They lived in linear streams of minutes and hours while I drifted, untethered and distorted, unable to anchor myself to a single moment. In desperation, I sought out anyone who might understand this twisted existence. Local shamans, desert nomads, even fringe scientists who spoke of time dilation and altered perception. No one could explain what was happening to me. The desert cult's teachings had warped more than just my body and mind. They had cracked open something primordial and terrifying inside the fabric of reality. I realized that escaping the cult's physical prison was only the beginning. The real imprisonment was temporal, a labyrinth where moments looped, stretched, and collapsed without mercy. Every step I took forward seemed to bend time backward, dragging me deeper into a space where the past, present, and future collided in a dizzying, endless spiral. I was a prisoner of a desert that never ended, of a time that refused to flow, and of a mind that could no longer distinguish salvation from damnation. The longer I stayed away from the desert cult, the more I realized that time was no longer a reliable companion, but a distorted mirror reflecting back a fractured self. Days blurred into nights, slipping through my fingers like fine sand, their boundaries dissolving into endless loops of confusion and fragmented memory. Each morning, I woke uncertain if hours or days had passed since I last opened my eyes. My mind, once a sanctuary of clarity and reason, became a prison of wandering thoughts and shifting realities. Faces from my past flickered like ghosts in a hall of mirrors. I found myself chasing moments that vanished before I could grasp them fully, leaving only an aching emptiness. The cult's influence wasn't just in the scars I bore or memories I tried to suppress. It had twisted my very perception of time, chaining me to a disjointed existence where I was neither truly free nor captive. The isolation I had fought to escape was now internalized, a maze of temporal distortions that no map could chart. The world around me changed too, but subtly, insidiously. Strangers in the desert town regarded me with wary eyes and hushed whispers, sensing invisible chains clinging to my spirit. Some whispered of curses, others suspected possession, but none understood the torment of living outside time's natural flow. The desert had ceased to be a simple landscape. It had become a living entity, breathing into my mind and warping reality itself. Mundane acts became exercises in surreal dissonance. Minutes flickered erratically, sometimes racing uncontrollably, other times grinding to an agonizing halt. I was no longer a man moving through time. I was a ghost haunting my own fractured existence, trapped between shifting dimensions. My memories overlapped until even my identity felt like a fragile illusion, slipping into the void. Even the people I met seemed to exist on different timelines, their words and actions out of sync with the world I thought I knew. Trust and understanding became impossible. Every interaction felt like deciphering a code that constantly rewrote itself. Sleep brought no relief, only deeper descent into the cult's grasp. Night after night, I was plagued by nightmares where the desert came alive, its sands swirling into storms, whispering secrets in an unknown language. I saw the cult leader's face, calm and knowing, his eyes glowing with cruel light. His voice echoed in my mind, a low hum of hypnotic promises and chilling warnings, blurring waking and dreaming. Time folded inward during these dreams, stretching moments of terror into eternal agony, making me question reality itself. Even waking hours were invaded by his presence, a mental suffocation pressing down like the desert sun scorching cracked earth. His words lingered like poison, twisting in my thoughts, reminding me the cult's hold extended beyond the desert. It was a metaphysical prison of warped time and broken realities, binding me as tightly as chains. I realized the cult's power was not confined to physical proximity. It was embedded in my consciousness, a parasite feeding off the fractures in my mind. In that moment of crushing clarity, I understood the true horror. My escape was no end, only a transition. The cult was no longer just behind me, it had become something inside me, a dark storm beneath my skin, a slow poison altering every fragment of my being. I was caught in an endless cycle where time had betrayed me, transforming freedom into a new captivity. My mind splintered into shards of past and present, each fragment haunted by echoes of the cult's rituals and the desert's silence. Even when surrounded by the familiar, I was adrift in an ocean of distorted memories and shifting realities. The people I loved and the places I cherished blurred into distant phantoms, as unreachable as the desert horizon. There was no escape from this labyrinth of time, only the slow unraveling of self, stretched across a landscape where moments bled into one another, endless and unforgiving. And now, as I stand on the edge of my fractured reality, I realize that the cult never truly held me in its desert prison. The real chains are woven from the threads of time itself, binding me to a fate worse than captivity, a life unmoored from linear existence, forever lost between what was, what is, and what might never be. I have escaped their physical grasp, but the desert's shadow clings to my soul, a silent specter reminding me that some escapes are only the beginning of a different kind of nightmare.